A woman fought her way up a mountain through a wall of screaming white, and the wind wanted her dead. It came at her sideways, hard enough to steal the breath from her chest, hard enough to take her off her feet and throw her down into the snow again, and again, and again. But she did not stop, because behind her, in the killing dark, something burned that could not be allowed to go out, and below her, buried under the drifts, lay a whole town that had laughed at her. Every one of them had laughed. They had called her foolish. They had called her broken. They had turned their eyes away from her in the street as if she were already gone. And now, as the storm tore the world apart around them, they were about to learn exactly what the foolish woman had built up there in the dark. A widow stood at the mouth of a frozen cave, holding a folded paper the whole town swore was worth nothing. The wind came down off the ridge and pulled at her coat, but she did not move. She only looked up at the dark crack in the mountain, the way a woman looks at a door she is not sure she should open. Her name was Maribel Vance. 58 winters had passed over her, and the last one had taken the only thing she could not afford to lose. Behind her, an old hound waited in the snow. His name was Boone, gray around the muzzle now, slow in the hips. But his eyes never left her. He had been her husband's dog first, and lately, it seemed, he was all that was left of the man. Down in the hollow, they were already laughing. Word travels fast in a small place. By the time Maribel had walked the long road home from the trading post, half the town knew what the foolish widow had done. She had spent her last coins on a hole in a mountain, a cave nobody wanted, a cave the miners had abandoned years ago, calling it worthless, calling it cold, calling it a place where only goats and ghosts went to die. $10 and a handshake. That was the price of her foolishness, and the town counted it out loud. It had happened inside the diner, beside a stove that ticked with weak heat. A broke prospector had pushed the ownership paper across the table, his hands shaking, his pride already gone. And Maribel had signed it without flinching. That was when Jed Coburn laughed. He was the town's carpenter, a big man with shoulders like cut timber and a grin he wore like armor. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the others, making sure they were watching. "Only fool in these mountains," he said, "buys a cave before winter." The room chuckled. Maribel did not. She folded the paper once, slid it into her coat, and asked the prospector one quiet question that nobody else seemed to hear. "Does the cold draft run deep in there?" The prospector blinked. Then he told her no. The air inside went still, he said, still and strange. She nodded slowly, and she walked out into the gray morning without giving the laughter the satisfaction of a backward glance. The town had a name, but names mean little in a place that has stopped believing in itself. Once they had believed in silver, then in timber, then in a railroad that surveyed the valley one summer and never came back. Now the hollow ran on credit, weak coffee, and old promises that always arrived too late to save anyone. And the man who held most of that credit was Cyrus Thorne. He owned the warehouse, the flour, the salt, the lamp oil that kept the long nights from swallowing the houses whole. Every cabin in the hollow owed him something, and Cyrus liked it that way. Men like him survived by becoming necessary. And a widow who thought she could survive without his ledger was a question he did not want anyone asking. But that was a worry for another night. The cabin Maribel returned to sat at the edge of town, where the wind crossed open ground before it ever reached the walls. She knew that wind too well now. Last winter, it had found the seams in the timber. It had crept in through cracks no eye could see, slow and patient, stealing the heat faster than the little stove could make it. She remembered waking one black morning with frost gathered along the inside of the blanket, the fire still burning, the cold winning anyway. And beside her, the man she had married 30 years before, no longer breathing. The house had not killed him with hunger. It had killed him with cold, the quiet kind, the kind that comes through walls built only to look like shelter. Ever since that morning, Maribel had stopped trusting walls. So when she laid the ownership paper on her table that evening, she did not see a hole in a mountain. She saw the one thing the wind could not crawl through. Stone. Boone lifted his head from the floorboards and watched her in the lamplight. "They think I've lost my mind," she told him softly. The old dog only thumped his tail once against the wood, as if to say he had followed her this far, and he was not about to stop now. That night, she barely slept. She sat beside the dying stove for hours, listening to the wind move through the walls the way it always did, that low and hungry sound. And by the time the gray light came, the wind had made her decision for her. She would go up and see exactly what her $10 had bought. The climb was harder than it looked. The slope was steep and slick, the snow thin enough to show the dead stone beneath it. Boone went ahead, stopping every few yards to look back at her, the way he used to look back at her husband. The cave waited above them like a crack in a dead world, dark, narrow, worthless by every account. She lit the oil lamp at the entrance, and she stepped inside. The first tunnel pinched in fast. She had to lower the lamp to keep the flame from brushing the wet stone overhead. Somewhere deep in the dark, water dripped, slow and echoing and old. The entrance smelled of cold mineral and wet earth. But farther in, the air changed. Maribel stopped. She felt it before she understood it. The air was still dry, still cold, but it had lost that killing bite the frozen timber of her cabin carried after sundown. She crouched and pressed her bare palm flat against the stone floor. Not warm, never warm, but it held none of the cruelty the wood had held the morning her husband did not wake. She raised the lamp, and the light found something she had not expected. Soot. Old black stains stretched across the ceiling, above a shallow pit where someone, long ago, had built a fire. She studied the marks the way a careful woman studies anything she does not yet trust. The smoke had gone up through a narrow crack in the rock, and away into the dark above. A chimney, a natural one, made by the mountain itself, long before anyone thought to laugh at it. Someone had survived down here. Someone once had been warm, but it was Boone who found the rest. The old hound ignored the entrance completely. He paid no mind to the fire pit, no mind to the smooth stone shelf carved by time. Instead, he circled twice near the eastern wall and curled himself tight against the stone there, the way an animal does when it has found the safest corner of a dangerous world. Animals pick warmth better than people, her husband used to say. Maribel followed the dog with her lamp, and that was when the light caught them. Marks, cut into the stone of the eastern wall, thin, deliberate, made by a knife or something like one. She leaned closer, her breath fogging in the lamplight, her heart beating in a way it had not beaten in a long time. She began to count, one line, for what she could only guess was a single week survived, and then another, and another, dozens of them, row after row of quiet little scars, scratched into the rock by some hand long gone, each one a week that someone had stayed alive down here in the dark, against the cold, against the loneliness, against all of it. Maribel Vance knelt before that wall for a long time. The wind moaned faintly through the crack in the ceiling above her, and the old dog watched her with his husband's eyes. She did not know yet who had made those marks. She did not know that the answer would one day break her heart, and then, slowly, begin to mend it. She knew only this. The town was wrong. The cave was not a place where things went to die. It was a place where someone had refused to, and kneeling there in the lamplight, the fool of the hollow, the woman they had spent all morning laughing at, made a quiet promise to a wall full of strangers' weeks. She would refuse too. The work began the next morning, before the sun had cleared the ridge. Maribel Vance did not own a horse. What she owned was a rough pine sled, 2 coils of frost-stiff rope, and a back that had carried more than its share of grief already. So she loaded the sled by hand, 50 pounds of dried beans, 2 dented tins of rendered fat, a sack of barley she had bought with coins she could not really spare. And then she pulled. The slope fought her every step. The rope bit into her shoulders through the wool of her coat, and the snow gave way beneath her boots. And more than once she went down hard onto one knee in the cold. Boone walked ahead of her the whole way, slow and patient, looking back each time she stopped to catch her breath. He never hurried her. He only waited, as if he understood that a woman of 58, climbing a mountain alone in winter, was not climbing it for the reason anyone in town believed. She was not chasing foolishness. She was running from a draft that had already killed once. By the time she reached the cave mouth, her arms were shaking, and her breath came in white clouds, and her heart was pounding against her ribs like something trying to get out. She sat down on a stone at the entrance, and for a long moment she simply looked at the dark and let the mountain hold her up. Then she stood, and she got back to work. That was the thing about Maribel Vance that the town had never once bothered to notice. She did not need anyone to believe in her. She had stopped waiting for that a long time ago. The first days inside the cave were not about comfort. They were about listening. She crouched by the old fire pit with a single candle, and she watched the way the small flame leaned, the way the thin smoke wanted to travel, the way the air moved through the chamber like slow breath through a sleeping chest. The mountain wanted to breathe a certain way, and she meant to learn how before she ever trusted it with a real fire. She found the natural chimney again, that narrow crack high in the rock where the old soot disappeared into the dark. She found the long stone shelf, smoothed by years. She found a shallow channel cut into the floor along one side, an old trench that had once carried water away from the place where a person might sleep. Someone had thought about all of it once. Someone careful, someone who had wanted to live. And every time she found another small mercy hidden in the stone, she thought of the wall of knife marks near the eastern corner, and she wondered who that someone had been. It was on the third day that the old man came. She did not hear him arrive. Boone did. The hound lifted his gray head from the floor and looked toward the entrance, and his tail moved once, slow and certain, the way it only moved for people the dog had already decided to trust. A shape stood in the pale light at the mouth of the cave. An old man, thin and weathered, with a coat that had seen too many winters and eyes that had seen more. "Thought I heard somebody up here," he said. His name, she would learn, was Eli Rourke. He had lived alone for years beyond the far ridge, a man the town remembered only when it needed to forget someone. He stepped inside slowly, and he looked at the stone walls the way a person looks at the face of someone long dead. Not with fear, with recognition. "You're the widow," he said. It was not a question. Maribel did not flinch from the word. She had worn it long enough now to wear it like her coat. "I am," she said. The old man walked deeper into the chamber, his hand trailing along the rock, and when he reached the eastern wall, he stopped. He looked at the knife marks for a long, long time, and something moved across his face that she could not name. "You found them," he said quietly. "Someone counted the weeks down here," Maribel said. "Survived them." The old man nodded slowly. His fingers hovered over the scars in the stone without quite touching them, the way a person reaches toward a wound that is not finished healing. "The cave keeps heat," he said at last, "if you treat it right, if you listen instead of fighting it." Then his eyes drifted toward the darkness farther in, where the lamplight did not reach. "But it keeps something else too," he said. "It keeps loneliness. Down here in the long dark, a person can stay warm and still die of being alone." Maribel looked at him, and she understood that the old man was not speaking about the cave at all. He stayed only a little while that first day. He did not pick up a tool. He did not take over. He was not that kind of man, and Maribel was not that kind of woman. He simply told her, in a few quiet words, the things the mountain had taught him long ago. "Stones hold heat," he said. "The right stones, flat and heavy, stacked close to the fire. They'll drink the warmth all evening and give it back all night, long after the flames go down. Don't try to heat the air," he said. "Air won't hold it. Heat the stone. Heat the earth. Make the mountain itself your hearth." And then he was gone, back over the ridge to wherever it was he lived, leaving Maribel alone with the dog and the dark and a head full of things to try. But the next morning, when she climbed the slope again, there was a neat stack of dried juniper wood waiting beside the entrance, and the old man was nowhere to be seen. So she built. She hauled river stones up the mountain, one heavy load at a time, the flat ones, the kind that would lie close against the fire and hold its warmth like a secret. Her hands cracked and bled in the cold, and she wrapped them in rags and kept going. She found rough planks in an abandoned shed at the edge of town and dragged them up to raise a bed frame off the floor. A full foot of empty air between her sleeping body and the cold stone that would otherwise pull the warmth straight from her bones. She widened the old drainage trench with a pick until melt water ran clean toward the lower crack near the entrance. And at the mouth of the cave, she hung 2 layers of cracked canvas across separate timber poles with a narrow gap between them, so the wind would have to fight through twice before it ever reached the place where she meant to live. It was slow. It was brutal. It was the work of a woman half her age, done by a woman who had buried her husband not one full season before. And every single day, the town laughed. She heard it when she went down for supplies. The looks, the grins half hidden behind coffee cups, the way conversation dropped to a murmur when she walked into the trading post and rose again, sharper the moment she walked out. "Widow's gone up the mountain to live in a hole," they said. "Grief does strange things to a woman. Won't last the first hard freeze." Maribel let them talk. She had learned something in the long nights after her husband died, something the town would not learn until it was nearly too late. People laugh loudest at the things they are most afraid they might need. The man who held the town's debt did not laugh. Cyrus Thorne watched. He stood in the door of his warehouse with one hand resting on the open ledger that hung from a nail beside it, and he watched the widow drag her sled past his building, load after load, week after week. Too many beans, too much lamp oil, barley sacks and rope coils and salt. Not the buying of a woman settling in for a quiet, dependent winter. The buying of a woman who meant to need no one. And that was the one thing Cyrus Thorne could not allow. His power was not built on cruelty, not the loud kind. It was built on need. Every cabin in the hollow owed him something, flour or nails, or the lamp oil that kept the dark from winning. As long as they owed him, they belonged to him. A widow who proved a person could survive outside his ledger was not just one lost customer. She was a question, and questions, once asked, have a way of spreading. He stopped her one gray afternoon outside the warehouse, while fine snow drifted down the muddy street in thin sheets. "Planning for a war, are you?" he said, his voice smooth as oil. Maribel tightened the rope on a sack of barley without looking up. "Planning for weather," she said. Cyrus smiled at that, but the smile never reached his eyes, and both of them knew it. He told her, in that careful way of his, that her credit had run thin, that a woman in her situation, alone, no longer young, ought to think hard about how much she could really afford to carry up a mountain, that the wise thing, the safe thing, would be to come back down, to take a room in town, to let folks who knew better look after her, to owe him, in other words. Maribel listened to all of it, and when he finished, she picked up the rope of her sled and looked the man square in the eye. "My husband trusted walls that were built to look strong," she said quietly. "It's why I'm a widow." Then she pulled her low up the road, into the snow, toward the mountain, and Cyrus Thorne watched her go with the flat, cold expression of a man who has just decided that something will have to be done. That night, long after the warehouse lanterns had gone dark, Maribel found something waiting beside her sled at the cave entrance. A sack, salt, clean and dry, carefully wrapped against the damp. No note, no name, only a single line of fresh boot prints leading back down the slope toward town, already half filling with new snow. She stood there in the cold for a long moment, the sack in her arms, her breath fogging in the lamplight. Someone had carried this up the mountain in the dark, someone who did not want to be seen doing it. She looked down the slope, toward the scattered lights of the hollow below, and she wondered, far down in the town, in an upstairs window near the warehouse, a young woman stood in the dark and watched the widow's lamp glow at the mouth of the cave. Her name was Verena Thorne, Cyrus Thorne's only daughter. She had grown up inside that warehouse, inside her father's ledger, inside the cold arithmetic of who owed what and who could be made to pay. She had watched him release flour to one family and refuse it to another, and she had watched the difference between the two be nothing but debt. She had said nothing all those years. A daughter learns young when silence is safer than questions. But she had stood at that window every evening since the widow went up the mountain, and she had watched a woman the whole town called a fool refuse to come down. And something in Verena Thorne had begun, very quietly, to wake. She did not know yet what it would cost her. She only knew that she had carried a sack of salt up a frozen slope in the dark, and that for once in her life, she had not felt like her father's daughter at all. She had felt like her own. The widow was not entirely without friends. There was one. Agnes Holloway was old, older than Maribel by a good stretch of years, with a back bent like a question mark and a tongue sharp enough to cut frozen rope. She had buried 2 husbands and outlived most of the people who had ever doubted her, and she had no patience left at all for the cowardice of a town that laughed at a grieving woman. She came up the slope one windy afternoon, slow and stubborn, and she stood at the mouth of the cave and looked in. "Dry or wet in there?" she called. Maribel turned, surprised. "Dry," she said, "dry enough to sleep." The old woman nodded as if that settled something. She told Maribel then, in the flat voice of someone recounting a thing too old to hurt anymore, about a winter long ago. A storm that had buried a whole stretch of country. A family that had survived it by crawling beneath an overturned wagon and packing snow against the wheels and refusing, simply refusing, to die. "Most folks freeze," Agnes said, "because they keep trying to heat the air, throw bigger and bigger fires at the cold, like it's a thing you can argue with." She shook her head. "You can't argue with cold, child. You can only refuse to let it reach you." Before she left, she pressed something into Maribel's hands. 2 jars of peach preserves, gold as summer, and a small cloth sack of dried mustard seed. "For the chest," she said, "for when the coughing starts." Maribel held the jars in her cold hands and felt something tighten in her throat that had nothing to do with the wind. "Why?" she asked, "when the whole town thinks I've lost my mind?" Agnes Holloway looked at her, and her old eyes were not unkind. "Because once," she said, "a long time ago, I was the one they laughed at." And she made her slow way back down the mountain, leaving the widow standing at the entrance with summer in her hands, and the first warmth she had felt in a long while spreading quietly through her chest. For the first time, Maribel Vance looked at the dark mouth of the cave and did not see failure. She saw possibility. But the mountain was not finished testing her. It happened on an evening when she had grown just confident enough to be careless. She had stacked the stones, she had hung the canvas, she had raised the bed and cut the trench, and she wanted, just once, to feel real warmth fill the chamber the way a hearth fills a home. So she built the fire too big. For a few minutes, it was beautiful. The flames climbed high and orange and threw their light dancing across the soot-black ceiling, and the chamber glowed, and Maribel felt the heat on her face, and let herself believe, just for a moment, that she had won. Then the smoke changed its mind. It did not rise. It rolled. A thick black wave of it came down off the ceiling and spread across the chamber in a slow, choking flood, and the air turned bitter and blinding, and Maribel's lungs seized and the world went gray at the edges. She tried to stand. Her legs would not answer. She went down onto her hands and knees on the cold stone, coughing, gasping, the smoke pressing down on her like a hand, and the lamp a useless smear of light somewhere in the dark, and the cave that was supposed to save her now filling with the very thing that had stolen the breath from her husband's chest. And then there was barking. Boone. The old hound exploded into sharp, frantic sound, and he shoved his whole gray body against her side, hard, again and again, driving her low along the floor where the air was still clean, herding her toward the entrance the way he must once have herded sheep in younger days. She felt his teeth close on her sleeve. She felt him pull, and somehow, half crawling, half dragged by a dog older than he had any right to be, Maribel Vance reached the canvas and burst out through it into the freezing dark and fell into the clean snow, gasping, the cold air burning her ruined lungs like the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. She lay there a long time. Boone collapsed beside her, his sides heaving, and pressed his warm body against hers, and she wrapped one trembling arm around the old dog and held on. She had nearly died, in the very place she had bet everything on, in the place she had crossed a town's laughter to reach. The cave had filled with smoke and tried to take her exactly the way the cabin had taken him, and kneeling there in the snow, with her hands shaking and her chest on fire and her dead husband's dog pressed against her ribs, something inside Maribel Vance finally broke. She had been so sure that she was different, so sure that grief had taught her something, that she could outthink the cold, that there was sense in a 58-year-old widow dragging stones up a mountain while a whole town laughed. But maybe they were right. Maybe she was exactly what they said she was. A foolish old woman, half mad with loss, chasing a dead man's dream up a frozen slope because she could not bear to sit alone in the cabin where he had died. Maybe the cave was just a hole in the mountain after all. Maybe she should go back down, take the room, take the credit, owe Cyrus Thorne her warmth and her winter and what was left of her pride, like everyone else, and just stop. She sat in the snow in the dark for a long, long time, and she wept the way a person weeps only when no one is there to see it, not loudly, just the deep, exhausted grief of someone who has carried a weight alone for too long, and finally felt it win. The lamp guttered low inside the smoke-filled cave. The wind moved over the mountain, and the old dog lifted his head and looked at her and waited. He did not look away. She would remember that later. The way Boone simply waited with her husband's patience in his eyes, as if he knew something she had forgotten. That a person can fall down on a mountain in the dark and still get up. She did not go down the mountain that night. When the smoke had cleared and the chamber had aired, she went back inside, not with a roaring fire this time, with a single candle, a tiny flame, a tiny truth. She knelt by the fire pit, and she watched the way the small light leaned and flickered, and she learned the thing the cave had been trying to teach her all along. It was not about how big a fire a person could build. It was about how well a person could listen. She fed the candle's lesson into everything after that. A low fire, not a high one. Slow heat, fed patient and small, letting the stacked stones drink it in hour after hour while the flames stayed humble. And near midnight, when she finally lay down on the raised bed in the dark, she reached out and laid her hand against the stone bench beside her. It was warm, not hot, not roaring, just warm. A steady, gentle warmth that did not rush away the moment the wind changed outside, the way the cabin's heat always had. She lay there in the dark, her hand on the warm stone, and the tears came again. But they were different tears this time. "I'm not crazy," she whispered into the dark, to her husband, to the dog, to the wall full of strangers' weeks. "I'm not crazy." And the cave breathed slow and steady around her, and held the warmth, and let her sleep. She thought the worst was behind her. It was not. Because while Maribel Vance was learning how the mountain wished to breathe, Cyrus Thorne had been learning something too. He had learned that laughter was not enough. A town that laughs at a foolish widow today might come to admire her tomorrow, if her foolishness kept her alive while their own cabins went cold. Cyrus Thorne had not built his quiet kingdom by waiting to see how things turned out. So he changed the story. It started small, the way poison always does. A word dropped here, a worried frown there. A man like Cyrus did not need to shout. He only needed to be believed. The cave, he let it be known, was not safe. That stone had been abandoned by the miners for a reason, hadn't it? They'd called it cursed in the old days. Said the rock was loose up there. Said the whole mountain shifted in a hard freeze. That the ceiling could come down on a sleeping soul without a sound of warning. A man wouldn't risk it, he said sadly. And to think of a poor widow up there, alone, half out of her mind with grief, sleeping under tons of treacherous stone. It was a tragedy waiting to happen. Someone ought to feel sorry for her, really. And the town, which had been laughing, slowly stopped laughing and started to whisper instead. Maribel felt the change the next time she came down for supplies. The grins were gone. That was almost worse. In their place were sidelong looks, the kind people give to the doomed. Conversations did not just drop when she entered now. They turned away from her entirely, the way folks turn from something they have already decided is lost. Even Jed Coburn, the carpenter, the loudest laugher of them all, would not meet her eyes. He stopped her once in the muddy street, and there was something in his big, rough face that might almost have been concern, if she had not known where it came from. "That rock's not safe, Maribel," he said. "Everybody knows it. You ought to come down before it comes down on you." She looked at him. "Who told you that, Jed?" she asked quietly. The carpenter's jaw worked. He did not answer. He did not have to. They both knew there was only one man in the hollow whose word became truth the moment he spoke it. Maribel pulled her sled up the mountain that evening with a colder weight on her shoulders than the supplies could account for. The laughter she could have carried forever. But this was different. This was the town deciding, gently, sorrowfully, that she was already gone. That the kindest thing was to stop looking at her. That a grieving widow under cursed stone was a thing to be mourned, not believed in. It was the loneliest kind of cold there is. The kind that comes not through the walls, but through the eyes of people who have stopped expecting you to live. That night, she sat by her small, careful fire, with the warm stones at her back and the old dog at her feet, and she thought about the old man's words. The cave keeps warmth, but it keeps loneliness too. She understood it now in a way she had not before. A person could do everything right, could build the perfect shelter, learn the breath of the mountain, refuse the cold with every stone and every careful flame, and still be left utterly, completely alone. She looked at the wall of knife marks across the chamber, all those weeks, all that survival, and she wondered for the first time if the person who made those marks had won it all, or if they had simply learned, week by lonely week, that staying warm and staying alive were not the same thing as staying whole. Boone shifted at her feet and laid his graying head against her boot. Outside, the wind moved over the mountain, but there was something different in it tonight. Maribel had spent her whole life near this country, and she knew its winters the way a woman knows the moods of someone she has loved a long time. The wind was not blowing the way winter wind blew. It had changed direction 3 times since sundown. The cold had taken on a strange, heavy stillness, the kind that presses on the ears, the kind that makes the lamp flame lean for no reason a body can see. And Boone would not settle. The old hound had abandoned his usual place near the warm stones. All evening he had paced toward the eastern wall, low and uneasy, curling tighter and tighter against the rock, as far from the entrance as he could get. Animals pick warmth better than people, her husband used to say, but they pick danger better too. Maribel sat very still by her small fire, and she watched her dog, and she listened to a wind that did not sound like any wind she knew, and somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the grief and the loneliness and the long exhaustion of the climb, a cold and certain knowing began to grow. Something was coming, something the laughing, whispering town below had no idea was on its way, and the only soul in all the hollow who could feel it in the air was a widow they had already decided to forget. The signs came faster now. Maribel Vance had lived near this country long enough to read it the way a woman reads a face she has loved for years. And the mountain, these last days, wore an expression she had seen only once or twice in a lifetime. The geese had gone over low, lower than they should, flying hard and silent towards somewhere warmer, as if they knew a thing the people below them did not. The wind had taken to changing direction 3 times in a single afternoon, and even on clear mornings, when the sky stretched pale and innocent over the hollow, a fine powder of snow drifted sideways through the air, falling from nothing, falling from everywhere. But it was Boone who frightened her most. The old hound had stopped sleeping near the entrance altogether. Every night now he moved deeper toward the eastern wall, curling himself tight against the cold stone, as far from the canvas as the chamber would let him go. An animal does not lie about fear, and Maribel, watching him, felt her own certainty harden into something close to dread. Whatever was coming, it was nearly here. She did not have to go down the mountain. She told herself that more than once as she pulled on her coat in the gray dawn. She owed the town nothing. They had laughed at her. They had whispered her into a grave she had not yet filled. They had turned their eyes away from her in the muddy street, as if she were already gone. She could stay up here, warm in her stone, and let them learn the hard way. But Maribel Vance had buried a man who died of cold in his own bed. And she had discovered in the long, lonely seasons since that she simply could not carry the knowledge of a coming danger and say nothing. It was not in her. So she went down. The diner was warm and loud when she pushed through the door, snow falling off her boots onto the worn boards. The men were arguing over the price of flour. Someone near the stove was talking about strange weather up on the high ridges. The talk was the small, comfortable talk of people who believed the worst was always somewhere else. It stopped when she walked in, not all at once, in pieces, a head turning, a cup lowering, a silence spreading out from her like a ring on still water. Maribel did not sit down. She stood near the door, with the cold still clinging to her coat, and she said the only thing she had come to say. "There's weather coming," she said. "Bad weather, worse than any of you have seen." She let that settle. "Lay in your wood, double it. Seal your drafts. Pack your walls. Do it now, today, before the sky turns. Because when it turns, it will turn fast, and it will not give you time." For one breath, the room only looked at her. Then Jed Coburn laughed. It was not the bright, cruel laugh from before. It was softer now, sadder, the laugh a man gives a person he has decided to pity, and somehow that was worse than all the mockery that had come before it. "Maribel," he said gently. "Maribel, sit down, have some coffee. You're worn out, that's all. Living up there all alone." "I'm not worn out," she said. "The widow's been talking to rocks," someone muttered near the stove, and a low ripple of laughter went around the room, careful and quiet, the kind of laughter that thinks it is being kind. A heavy-set man leaned back in his chair. "And what is it tells you this great storm's coming?" he asked. "Your dog?" More laughter. Maribel looked at them, at their warm faces in the warm room, full of coffee and certainty. Every one of them a single cold night away from a danger they could not imagine. "The geese," she said simply. "The wind, the way the snow falls out of a clear sky. The same things that told folks long before there were almanacs and calendars." Her voice did not rise. "My husband used to read it. He's the one who taught me. And he's the one the cold took. In a bed. Behind walls. Everybody swore. We're strong." The room shifted. Uncomfortable. The minister, a soft-spoken man, tried to smooth the moment away. "Every winter makes folks uneasy, Maribel," he said. "There's no shame in it." She turned her eyes toward the window, toward the sky beyond the glass. It had gone the color of old lead. "Not this winter," she said quietly. Nobody answered her. The only sound in the room was the stovepipe ticking softly with heat, and the wind beginning, very faintly, to lean against the diner walls from outside. Maribel pulled her coat tighter, and she walked back out into the gray. She did not look behind her. No one followed. And as she climbed the road toward the mountain, the cold sled rope biting her shoulders, she thought she finally understood the loneliest truth of all. It was not being laughed at that broke a person. It was being right, and being alone with it. The storm did not come with snow first. It came with pressure. Maribel felt it that very night, deep in the dark, when she startled awake without knowing why. The cave was still. The fire had burned down to a soft red glow among the stones. Nothing moved, and yet the lamp flame leaned. It leaned hard to one side, bending as if some invisible hand pressed against it, though no draft she could feel moved through the chamber. She sat up slowly, her heart beginning to knock against her ribs. Across the chamber, Boone jerked awake. The old hound came up off the stone all at once, ears high, body stiff, every gray hair along his spine standing on end. He stared at the canvas curtains at the entrance, and a low sound began in his chest, a sound she had never heard him make before. And then the mountain heard it. A deep, rolling roar came down across the ridge above the cave, vast and metallic and endless, like the whole sky had begun to move at once. It was not thunder. Thunder ends. This did not end. It built and went on building until the very stone seemed to hum with it. The canvas at the entrance snapped taut. And then the snow came. It did not fall. It flew. It came sideways across the mouth of the cave in a screaming white river, thick as river foam, and within minutes the gray world beyond the entrance simply ceased to exist. There was no slope, no sky, no town below. There was only white and roar, and the wind throwing itself against the mountain like something alive and furious and starving. Maribel sat very still by the dying fire, with the old dog pressed against her legs, and she listened to the storm test every crack and seam of the shelter she had built. The double canvas strained and shuddered at the entrance, but behind it the chamber held. No rushing draft crawled across the floor. No freezing crosswind found her bed. The stones at her back still carried the warmth she had fed them, slow and patient, hour by hour. The small fire crackled on, untroubled, while the world outside tore itself apart. The cave barely noticed. And that, Maribel realized, was what truly frightened her. Because if the storm felt this far away from inside the mountain, then down below, in the hollow, behind the thin walls of cabins built only to look strong, the town was already suffering far worse than any of them had ever imagined. She thought of the diner, the warm faces, the careful laughter. She thought of Jed Coburn telling her to sit down and have some coffee. She thought of the children, and she sat in the firelight with her hands clenched in her lap, and she prayed to a God she was not sure was listening, that the ones who had laughed at her had at least, by some mercy, laid in their wood. The storm did not weaken with the dawn. If anything, it grew, the roar settling into a steady, grinding fury that shook fine dust loose from the cave ceiling. Maribel did not sleep. She fed the fire small and slow, and she counted her supplies by lamplight, and she listened, and near what she guessed was noon, through the screaming white beyond the entrance, she saw a shape. At first she thought it was a trick of the storm, a darker swirl in all that blinding white. But Boone saw it too. The old hound was on his feet at once, barking, hurling himself at the canvas. The shape moved. It struggled up the lower slope, bent against the wind, a small dark figure fighting its way toward the cave through snow that came past the knees. And then, halfway up, it stopped. It swayed, and it fell sideways into the drift, and did not get up. Maribel was moving before she had decided to. She threw on her coat, wrapped a rope twice around her waist, and lashed the other end to the timber post at the entrance. And she went out into the storm. The cold hit her like a wall. It stole the breath straight out of her chest and turned the air to knives, and the wind shoved her hard enough to take her off her feet before she had gone 5 steps. She went down. She got up. She went down again. Boone ran ahead, low to the ground, a gray streak in the white, barking back to her, leading her. The figure in the snow was an old woman, Agnes Holloway. Her face was gray. One glove had frozen solid into a shell of white ice. She was barely conscious, her lips moving on words too faint to hear, and when Boone reached her, he began at once to lick her face, frantic, whining, refusing to leave her side. Maribel got her hands under the old woman's arms, and then began the worst few minutes of her life. Agnes was not heavy, but she was dead weight, and the slope was steep, and the wind struck them sideways again and again, shoving them both toward the drop, so that more than once Maribel felt her own boots slide and her own balance go, with nothing between them and the long fall but a rope and her own stubborn arms. She hauled with everything 58 years had left in her, screaming into the storm with effort, her muscles tearing, the rope burning through her frozen mittens, and the dog circling them, barking, pressing his body against Agnes's legs as if he could push her up the mountain by sheer will. Inch by inch, the cave came closer, and at last, with a final desperate heave, Maribel dragged the old woman through the canvas and into the warmth, and the two of them collapsed together onto the floor of the chamber, and the storm screamed on, shut out, behind them. She did not let herself rest. She stripped the frozen glove from Agnes's hand and chafed the gray fingers between her own. She moved the old woman close to the stones, not the fire, the warm stones, because slow heat was safer than fast heat for a body the cold had nearly claimed. She wrapped her in every blanket she had and fed the fire just enough, and waited, her own hands shaking, her own face burning as it thawed. And slowly, color came back into Agnes Holloway. Her eyes fluttered open. Her gray lips found their way back toward pink. And after a long while, her trembling fingers reached out, almost on their own, and touched the warm stone bench beside her. She went very still. Then her old eyes filled and spilled, and she turned her head and looked at the widow the whole town had laughed at. "You built a warm heart inside the mountain," she whispered. Maribel could not answer. She only took the old woman's thawing hand in both of hers and held it, while the fire crackled low and the storm raged on outside, and the two of them sat together in the one warm place in all the frozen hollow. It was Agnes who told her how to find Eli. When the old woman was strong enough to speak in full sentences again, she explained, in a halting voice, how she had come to be on that slope at all. She had been trying to reach the widow's cave before the storm trapped her in her own cold cabin, and on the way, near the lower ridge, she had passed the old man's place. "Eli Rourke," she said. "He's coming up too. Said he meant to. Said his cabin wouldn't hold against this one." She coughed. "Said yours would." And not an hour later, the canvas parted again, and the old miner staggered in, caked shoulder to boot in blown snow, brushing ice from his beard with hands that shook. He took one look at the warm chamber, at Agnes wrapped by the stones, at the steady, humble little fire, and the heat resting deep in the rock, and something in his weathered face eased for the first time since Maribel had met him. "Knew you'd get it right," he said gruffly. He lowered himself down beside the wall, and for a while he simply sat, getting his breath back, letting the warmth find its way into his old bones. The storm howled beyond the canvas. Boone settled near him, having decided long ago that the old man belonged. And it was there, in the firelight, with the storm sealing them all inside the mountain together, that Eli Rourke finally told her the thing he had been carrying since the day he first saw her in this cave. His eyes had drifted again to the eastern wall, to the knife marks. "You ever wonder," he said quietly, "who made those?" Maribel followed his gaze. "Every day," she said. The old man was silent a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had gone soft and far away. The voice of a man reaching back across more years than he cared to count. "Long time ago," he said, "when I was younger than you are now, there was a winter like this one. Worse, maybe. Caught two young men out in this country with no way home." He paused. "They found this cave, or it found them, and they holed up in here, the both of them, and they waited the winter out, week by week, marking the wall so they wouldn't lose count of the days." He nodded toward the scars in the rock. "He cut them with a little knife he kept all his life," Eli said. "Kept it in close with his medicines after. Said a man ought to hold on to whatever got him through a thing like that." Maribel had gone very still. "One of those young men was me," Eli said. He let that sit. Then he turned his head, and he looked at her, and his old eyes were wet. "The other one," he said gently, "married you." The chamber seemed to go silent, even with the storm screaming outside. Maribel could not breathe. "No," she said. The word came out small. "No, he never said. In 30 years, he never once told me about a cave, about a winter, about any of it." "I know," Eli said. "I know he didn't." The old man looked into the fire. "Some things a man survives," he said, "and never wants to speak of again. Not because of the cold. We beat the cold. We were good at the cold." His jaw worked. "It was the other thing. The long dark. The two of us in here week after week, with nothing but each other in the silence, watching the marks pile up on that wall and not knowing if spring would ever come for us at all." He shook his head slowly. "We came out alive," he said, "but we came out marked, same as that wall. Your husband, he buried it deep, built a whole good life on top of it, found you. And I think he never told you because he wanted you to be the part of his life the cave never touched." Maribel was weeping now, silently, the tears running down a face that had wept too many times alone this winter. She turned and looked at the eastern wall, at the marks, all those weeks, the careful, stubborn scars cut into the stone by two frightened young men, one of whom would, decades later, grow old beside her, and one of whom sat across the fire from her now. And one of those young men had been the boy she would one day love, had knelt right there in this very dark and refused to die, had carried that secret survival inside him all the years she knew him, folded up beneath the easy warmth of the man she had married, never once letting it touch her. She rose on legs that did not feel like hers. She crossed the chamber, and she knelt before the eastern wall where Boone had curled himself the very first day, in the warmest corner, the corner an animal knew before any person had told it. The corner where, all those years ago, a frightened young man had likely slept. She pressed her palm flat against the marks. The stone was warm beneath her hand, warm from the fire she had built, the fire she had learned to build, in the place that had once saved the man she loved. And something broke open inside Maribel Vance that night. Not the breaking from before, in the snow, when she had thought herself a fool. This was a different breaking. This was the breaking of a thing that had been clenched tight for too long, finally letting go, because all this time the whole town had it wrong. Agnes had it half right. Even Maribel herself had believed it, in her darkest hour out in the snow. A foolish widow, they said, chasing a dead man's dream up a frozen mountain because she could not bear to sit alone in the house where he died. But that was not it at all. She had not been chasing his dream. She had been finishing it, by blood, by instinct, by some pull she could not name. She had climbed to the one place on this earth that had once held him in the dark and given him back to the world. She had bet everything she had on a hole in a mountain that a town called Cursed and Worthless. And it turned out to be the very stone that had cradled the man she loved through his longest night. She had not come up here to die near his memory. She had come up here to live where he had lived. And she had been right to. She knelt there a long time, with her hand on the warm marks and the tears on her face, and the storm raging far away beyond the canvas. Behind her, the old man let her be. Agnes watched her with kind and knowing eyes. The dog laid his gray head against her boot. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady. "He'd have liked," she said softly, "knowing it kept somebody warm again." Eli Rourke nodded. "He'd have liked knowing it was you," he said, and for the first time since the morning she woke beside a husband who would not wake again. Maribel Vance did not feel alone. The storm did not care for any of it, of course. It went on screaming outside, hour after hour, and somewhere in the depths of the long night, Maribel finally understood that what she had built was no longer a hiding place for one grieving widow. There was Agnes, sleeping warm by the stones. There was Eli, the last living witness to her husband's secret winter, dozing against the wall. There was Boone, guarding the eastern corner as if the boy who had once slept there might still need looking after. The cave had room. The cave had warmth. And down in the hollow, behind walls that had never been built to hold a storm like this, there were people freezing in the dark. People who had laughed at her. People who had pitied her. People who had turned their eyes away. People with children. Maribel sat by her small, faithful fire, and she felt the weight of it settle onto her shoulders, heavier than any sled rope had ever been. She could keep this warmth for the three of them. She could let the town reap what its laughter had sown. No one would ever blame her. No one would even know. But she thought of her husband, kneeling in this dark all those years ago, refusing to die. And she thought of what kind of woman she wanted to be in the warmth he had left her. She was still thinking it when the first knock came. It was faint, beneath the roar of the storm, so faint she almost missed it. A weak, desperate pounding against the timber post beside the canvas, the sound of a fist that had almost no strength left in it. Boone was up at once, barking. Maribel rose. She crossed to the entrance, and she pulled back the heavy canvas, and the storm howled in. And there in the screaming white stood a man she knew, snow to his shoulders, his face gray with cold, and in his arms, wrapped in 2 frozen quilts, a child who was not moving. The man looked at her with eyes full of terror and shame. "Please," he said, his voice cracked. "Please. I laughed at you. I know I did. But it's my girl, Maribel. It's my little girl." The wind tore at them both, and Maribel Vance, widow, fool, keeper of a warm heart inside a cursed mountain, reached out into the storm and pulled them in. The child's name was Lily. She could not have been more than 7, and when her father laid her down by the warm stones, she did not stir at all. Her lips had gone a pale, terrible blue. Her small chest barely moved. Their chimney had iced shut in the night, the man said, the words tumbling out of him broken and fast. The smoke had nowhere to go. It had filled the cabin instead of leaving it, and by the time he understood what was happening, his little girl was already slipping away from him. So he had wrapped her in everything he owned, and he had carried her out into the storm, toward the one warm place he could think of, toward the woman he had mocked. His name was Hollis Geddes, and he was on his knees now beside his daughter, and a man like that does not have words. He had only his hands, useless and shaking, hovering over the child as if afraid to touch her. Maribel moved him gently aside. "Let me," she said. A child the cold has nearly emptied cannot be rushed back into the world. So she did not rush. She built the warmth around Lily the way the mountain built it, from the stone outward, slow and low. A heated rock wrapped in cloth at the small of the back, another at the soles of the tiny feet, a third laid gentle against the cheek. She put her own mouth close to the child's and breathed for her when the small chest forgot. And the whole time she talked, soft, steady, nonsense really. The name of the dog, the color the grass would become spring, the peaches that waited gold in Agnes's jars, anything at all to give a child lost in the dark a thread to follow back. And Boone, the old dog, did a thing then that Maribel would never forget. He came and lay down against Lily's other side, pressing the whole length of his warm gray body against her, and he stayed there, and he did not move. The minutes stretched out long as years. The storm screamed beyond the canvas, and then, at last, Lily coughed. A small, weak, wet little cough. The most beautiful sound in the world. Her eyelids fluttered. A faint, faint pink crept back into her lips, and Hollis Geddes made a sound that was half sob and half prayer, and gathered his daughter's hand against his face, and wept into it without shame. When he could speak again, he did not look at Maribel. He looked at the floor. "I should have backed you," he said, "at the diner, when you tried to warn us." His voice broke. "I knew you weren't crazy. I think I always knew. But Thorne holds half my debt, and a man with a daughter to feed. He learns to laugh at whatever the powerful man laughs at." Maribel adjusted a warm stone beside the sleeping child. "You're here now," she said simply, and she meant it. That was the whole of it. There was no room in her, after the winter she had lived, for the keeping of old scores. The man had laughed. The man had carried his dying child up a mountain to the very person he had mocked. The cold did not care about either of those things, and Maribel found that she did not either. There was only the warmth. And who needed it? Hollis held his daughter's hand through the rest of that long night, and did not sleep. And color came slowly back into Lily Geddes like dawn coming back to the world. The next knock came near morning. It was Jed Coburn, the carpenter, the big man with shoulders like cut timber who had leaned back in his chair and called her the only fool in the mountains for buying a cave before winter. He came through the canvas with his son in his arms. The boy was called Wren, a thin child of 9 or 10, and he was burning with fever, his breath coming in hard, wet rasps that Maribel did not like the sound of at all. The cold had gotten into the boy's chest. She had heard that rasp before. It was the kind that, untended, could carry a child off as surely as any drift. Jed Coburn stopped 3 steps inside the cave, and he stood there, holding his sick son, and he looked around the chamber, and something happened in his big, rough face that no one in the hollow had ever seen happen before. He saw the warm stones, the raised beds up off the cold floor, the food stored high and dry, the dry wood stacked where it would not freeze, the double canvas breaking the wind, the small, humble, faithful fire that held its heat instead of throwing it away. He saw that all of it worked. Every single thing the widow had done up here, everything the town had laughed at, every load she had dragged up the slope while they grinned into their coffee, it all worked. And his own cabin, built by his own skilled hands, with walls a master carpenter was proud of, had nearly killed his boy. I laughed at this place, Jed Coburn said. His voice was very quiet. Maribel took the feverish child from his arms. I know you did, she said. Bring him to the fire. Nothing else followed. No speech. No reckoning. No moment where the widow stood tall and let the carpenter feel the full weight of how wrong he had been. She had no use for it. She wrapped Wren in heated blankets, and she set a pot of water near the fire, and she crumbled into it the last of the dried mustard seed Agnes had pressed on her, and the herbs she had, and she went to work on bringing the boy's fever down. That night, when he thought everyone was sleeping, Jed Coburn sat alone by the bedroll where his son lay, watching the steady flame and the warm stone walls, and the old dog guarding the children like one more blanket. And the carpenter lowered his face into his big, rough hands, and he wept where he thought nobody could see. For all the years he had measured a man's worth by the straightness of his timber and the strength of his joints. For the boy who was sick because of his pride. For the woman he had mocked, who was up half the night saving the very child he had failed. Good lumber, he understood now, could not defeat bad physics. And a strong wall meant nothing if it was built only to look strong. Maribel saw him. She said nothing. She let a man have his grief in the dark, the way she had been let to have hers. But in the morning she handed him the first cup of broth, and she put him to work hauling stones, and she gave him back, in labor and in trust, the dignity the night had taken from him. That was her way. She did not break people with their mistakes. She put them to work, and she let them earn their place by the fire. They kept coming after that. The storm did not break, and so the hollow came to the mountain. By 2s and 3s, half frozen, snow to their shoulders, they pounded on the timber post, and Maribel pulled them in. A young mother with a baby that would not stop crying. 2 brothers from the far edge of town, whose roof had gone in the first night. An old man who lived alone and had run out of wood. By the 3rd day of the storm, There were more than 10 souls in the cave that the whole hollow had called a worthless hole, and the chamber that had once held one grieving widow now held more breath and more fear and more need than Maribel had ever imagined it would. It changed the sound of the place. Hunger changes the sound of a room. It makes small things loud. The scrape of a spoon, the drip of water from thawing boots, the rustle of a hand reaching into a bean sack. And it was hunger, in the end, that found the cracks in people that the storm could not. But first, it was the cave that nearly failed. Agnes Holloway spotted it. The old woman lay awake near the stones one night, watching the ceiling the way only the old and the sleepless do, and she saw it before anyone else. A thin skin of ice had formed across the rock above the sleeping corner during the cold of the night. And now, as the warmth of all those bodies and the patient fire rose, the ice was beginning to melt. Cold droplets had begun to fall, slow and steady, onto the blankets and the children below. "The cave's sweating," Agnes said. Boone had noticed too. The old hound had abandoned his place and moved closer to the fire, grumbling low, uneasy. Maribel looked up at the dripping ceiling, and a cold understanding came over her. A warm cave could still sweat. The very heat that kept them alive was meeting the killing cold of the upper rock, and where the two met, water gathered. And wet blankets in a hard freeze were not a discomfort. They were a danger. A child who slept wet could be lost as surely as a child left out in the storm. She did not sleep the rest of that night. She narrowed one of the small vents with loose stone, slowing the cold air that fed the trouble. She shifted the children's beds away from the weeping rock, and she heated a row of extra stones and set them carefully along the damp stretch of wall until the cold surface warmed just enough to stop the gathering. The dripping slowed. Then it stopped. Jed Coburn worked beside her through all of it, hauling the heavy stones without a word of complaint. And when it was done, the two of them stood in the dark and looked up at the dry ceiling, and the carpenter shook his head slowly. "You think in 3 dimensions," he said. "Heat, cold, air, water, all of it at once. I only ever thought about wood." Maribel wiped her hands on her coat. "My husband thought this way," she said quietly. "I just listened to him for 30 years. It was the closest she had come to speaking of him to anyone but Eli. And Jed Coburn, who had laughed at her, had the grace to simply nod and let the dead man stand there in the warm dark a moment, honored. The trouble with Brock Tanner came on the 4th night. He was a big man, a freight hauler from the rough camps on the far road, built like a barn door and twice as stubborn. He had come in late, half frozen, with his boy Caudle, a thin and watchful child of 12 who flinched whenever his father's voice got loud, and his father's voice got loud often. Maribel measured the food the same way every night. Equal portions, no exceptions. She served herself last and always a little less, though she let no one see her do it. There was not much. The bean sacks had gone soft and shallow. The fat clung in thin streaks at the bottoms of the jars. Every cup of beans was counted now against the question no one would say aloud. How many days were left? Brock Tanner looked down at the small portion in his tin and then around at the others, and his face darkened. "I'm twice the size of half the folks in this cave," he said. The fire crackled. No one answered. "I work harder. I need more. He set his jaw. It's only sense. Maribel handed the next portion to a child without changing the measure of it by a single bean. Brock Tanner stood up. He stood up hard, kicking dust across the floor, and he took one step toward the bean sacks, and the chamber went very still. Jed Coburn rose to meet him. The carpenter planted himself between the big man and the food, and he did not raise his voice, and he did not back down. And from his place by the wall, old Eli Rourke spoke, soft and slow, his eyes on the fire. Saw two grown men once, the old miner said, kill each other over a sack of dried beans. Long winter. Far from here. He shook his head. Wasn't enough beans left over to bury either one of them proper. The silence after that was thick enough to cut, and then into it came a small voice. Pa, stop. It was Caudle. The boy stood near the back wall, holding his own untouched portion in both hands, and his thin face was burning with shame. He looked at his father, and his eyes were wet, and his voice shook. You're scaring everybody, the boy said. Just stop. Brock Tanner turned and looked at his son. And whatever the carpenter's body could not do, and whatever the old man's words could not do, the sight of the shame on his own boy's face did. The big man's shoulders came down. He looked at the small portion in his hand. He looked at the children. He looked at the widow, still calmly measuring the beans, taking the least for herself. And he sat down. He did not speak for the rest of the night. But the next morning, Brock Tanner was the first one up, hauling water, melting snow, doing the heaviest work in the cave without being asked, as if his big body had finally found the use it was meant for. And that night, Caudle did not sit beside his father. He sat by the fire between Lily and the old dog with the other children. It hurt the big man to see it. Maribel could tell, but it was the kind of hurt that heals a person if they let it. And Brock Tanner, it turned out, was ready to let it. The knock that came on the fifth night was different. Not desperate, careful. 3 slow, deliberate raps against the timber post. Maribel pulled back the canvas, and the storm howled in, and standing in the screaming white was a young woman she had seen only once or twice in the town below, frost clinging to her lashes, half her face gone numb with cold. Across one shoulder she carried a flour sack. Against her coat she held 2 glass jars, wrapped tight against the wind. It was Verena Thorne, Cyrus Thorne's daughter. Boone stepped aside to let her pass, and more than one person in the cave noticed the old dog do it, and wondered. Verena came in and lowered her burden carefully by the food shelves. Flour, rendered fat. And in the jars, a thick amber syrup, dark and fragrant, boiled down from pine resin and wild honey, the old remedy for a chest gone bad with cold. The very thing Maribel saw at once that the boy Wren needed. Maribel looked at the supplies, then at the young woman's frozen, exhausted face. What happened? She asked quietly. Verena Thorne did not answer at first. She stared into the fire while the snow melted from her sleeves and dripped onto the stone. My father caught me, she said at last, taking food from the storeroom. The chamber had gone silent. He told me, Verena said, and her voice was very steady, the unnatural steadiness of someone holding something terrible very still. That if I walked out that door, I should not come back. The fire cracked, And then Verena Thorne said the thing that changed the air in the cave entirely. "The storeroom is full," she said. She looked around at the gaunt faces in the firelight, at the soft, shallow bean sacks, at the children, at the widow who served herself last. "It's full," she said again. "Flour, salt, pork, beans, enough to feed this whole hollow for weeks." Her jaw tightened. "But he only gives it to the families whose debts still chain them to his ledger, the ones who owe him, the ones who'll owe him more for the privilege of not freezing." She drew a shaking breath. "He says he's protecting his property. He says a man can't be expected to give away what's his." No one cursed Cyrus Thorne. That would have been easier. Instead, a heavier silence settled over the cave, the kind people carry when a thing they had hoped was only rumor turns out to be true. Down in the dark hollow, behind a locked warehouse door, there was enough food to keep every child in that cave fed and warm. And it sat there, counted, guarded, held back from the freezing by a man who had decided that what was owed to him mattered more than what was owed to the simple fact of being human. Maribel did not rage. She had thought she might, if she ever learned a thing like this. But standing there, looking at the trembling young woman who had carried Summer up a frozen mountain in the dark and lost her home for doing it, what Maribel felt was not rage. It was a deep and weary grief for what fear does to people, for what a man becomes when he loves his ledger more than his neighbors, for a daughter who had grown up inside that coldness and had finally, at terrible cost, decided to walk out of it. She crossed the chamber and she wrapped both arms around Verena Thorne without a single word. The young woman went stiff with shock. For a long moment she did not move at all, this daughter of the coldest man in the hollow, unused to being held. Then the storm moaned low across the mountain outside, and Verena Thorne began to weep against the widow's shoulder. Not loudly, just the exhausted, broken grief of someone who has finally understood that she will not have to face the dark alone tonight. "You can stay," Maribel said softly. "There's warmth here for anyone who needs it. That's the whole point of the place." And so the daughter of the man who hoarded the town's food took her place by the fire of the widow he had tried to ruin. It was the 6th day when Wren took a turn. The boy had seemed to be mending. The fever had broken once, and Maribel had let herself hope. But fevers are liars, and in the deep of the 6th night, Wren's fever came roaring back, higher than before, and his breath went shallow and fast, and his small body burned beneath the blankets like a coal. The pine syrup helped. But the jars were nearly empty now, given out drop by careful drop to every coughing child in the cave, and what remained would not be enough to carry the boy through. Maribel knelt beside him with her hand on his burning forehead, and she felt the old familiar terror rising in her chest. She had felt it before. She had felt it the morning she woke beside a man who would not wake. And she knew, with the cold certainty that comes from having lost once already, that the boy would not last the night without something more. There was something more. That was the worst of it. In her old cabin, down at the edge of town, in a wooden box her husband had kept all his life, there were the herbs and the remedies of a man who had spent his youth surviving things most people only died of. Fever powders, dried roots, the pine and honey draught made strong, the real strong, the kind he had learned in a cave one terrible winter long ago. She had not been able to bring herself to open that box since he died. It sat in the cold cabin where his heart had stopped, and she had left it there because to open it was to smell him again, to touch the things his hands had touched, to stand in the room where the cold had taken him. She had thought she would never set foot in that cabin again. She was wrong. "Eli," she said quietly. "How far to my cabin in this?" The old man looked at her and his face went hard with understanding. "Too far," he said. "In this wind, far too far. A young man wouldn't make it. You'll not make it." "There's medicine there," Maribel said. "Real medicine. His medicine. Enough to break this fever." She looked down at the burning child. "Wren won't see the morning without it." "Then I'll go," Jed Coburn said, rising, his face gray. "You don't know where the box is. You don't know what's in it. You'd waste an hour searching a dead man's cabin while your boy slips away." Maribel was already pulling on her coat. "I know exactly where it is. I know exactly what to take. I've known for 30 years. Maribel." Agnes Holloway's old voice was sharp with fear. "You are not a young woman." Maribel paused at the canvas, and she turned, and she looked back at them all. At Wren, burning. At Lily, saved. At Jed, who had laughed and then wept. At Brock, made gentle. At Verena, who had given up everything. At Eli, the last witness to her husband's secret winter. At Agnes, who had believed in her when no one else would. At the old dog, already on his feet, already at her side, already knowing. "No," she said. "I'm not a young woman." And something in her face was almost a smile. "But I'm the woman who's still alive. And that boy is going to be too." She lashed the rope around her waist, and Maribel Vance walked out into the storm. The world beyond the canvas was not a world at all. It was white and raw and a cold so absolute it did not feel like cold anymore, only like a great hand closing around her, squeezing the warmth and the breath and the very thought out of her. The wind came at her sideways, again and again, shoving her down the slope faster than she meant to go, and then driving her back so that every step was a battle fought and a battle lost. She could not see the cave behind her. She could not see the town below. She could not see her own hands. There was only Boone. The old dog ran ahead of her, low to the ground, a darker shape in all that white, barking back to her through the wind, leading her down a slope he should not have been able to find. He had walked this mountain with her husband long before Maribel ever climbed it, and now he walked it again, gray and slow and faithful past all reason, leading the man's widow down through a storm toward the cabin where the man had died. She fell, more times than she could count. Once she went down and simply could not find the will to rise. The cold was so total, the dark so complete, and for one terrible moment, lying in the drift, Maribel thought of her husband and thought how easy it would be, how warm it would almost feel, to simply close her eyes here and let the white take her and be with him again. And then Boone was there, his teeth in her sleeve, his whole body shoving against hers, his frantic, broken bark in her face, refusing to let her stop. And Maribel remembered the boy, burning in the warm dark behind her on the mountain, a boy whose father had laughed at her, and who would die anyway if she lay down in the snow. She got up. She got up out of the drift with a sound that was half a scream and half a sob, and she put one hand on the old dog's back, and she followed him down through the screaming dark. The cabin rose out of the storm at last, low and buried and half swallowed by the snow. The door fought her. The cold had sealed it. She threw her whole weight against it again and again until it gave, and she fell inside, into the dark and frozen room where the worst morning of her life had happened. She did not let herself feel it. There was no time to feel it. She found the box by touch, in the dark, exactly where it had always been. His box. The wood smooth under her frozen fingers from a lifetime of his hands. She did not open it there. She could not. She wrapped it inside her coat, against her heart, and she turned back toward the door and the storm. And for just one moment, one single moment, she stood in the dark of the cabin where her husband had died. "I'm taking your medicine," she whispered into the empty room. "There's a boy. He's going to live. Because of you." Her voice broke. "Because of you." Then she put her shoulder to the wind, and she followed her old dog back up the mountain, into the dark, toward the warmth. How she made it back up that slope, she would never afterward be able to say. The climb nearly finished her. The rope at her waist, the box against her heart, the dog ahead of her in the white, and her own body failing piece by piece, her hands gone, her face gone, her thoughts narrowing to a single point of light somewhere up in the dark. She did not remember reaching the canvas. She remembered hands, many hands, pulling her through, into warmth, into light, into the sound of a people. Jed Coburn's voice, Agnes weeping, Brock Tanner lifting her like she weighed nothing, and Boone, collapsing on the stone beside her, his sides heaving, his task complete. And then the box was out of her coat and open at last, and Maribel was crawling toward the burning child on hands and knees that would not hold her, because she alone knew what was in it and what to do. She broke Wren's fever before dawn. It took everything her husband had left behind, and everything she had learned at his side, and the long hours of a night she would never forget. But near morning, the boy's burning skin went damp and cool. His breath eased. His shallow gasping slowed into the deep, even rhythm of true sleep. And Jed Coburn, the carpenter who had laughed loudest, held his son's hand and looked at the half-frozen widow slumped exhausted against the warm stones, and he could not find a single word in all his life big enough. So he did not try. He only took her ruined, frost-bitten hand in both of his, and he pressed his forehead to it, and he held it there a long, long time. That morning, there was almost no food left. Maribel divided what remained the way she always had, equal portions, herself last. But there was so little now that the portions were barely a mouthful, and everyone in the cave understood, without a word spoken, that the question they had not said aloud could not be put off much longer. And then Brock Tanner did a thing. The big man, who had once stood up and demanded more, took his own small portion, and he crossed the chamber, and he knelt down, and he tipped half of it into the bowl of the widow who had nearly died in the night. "Eat, Maribel," he said gruffly. "You first, this time." And one by one, around the fire, the others did the same. Hollis, Jed, Agnes, Verena, even the children, tipping their precious mouthfuls into her bowl, until the woman who had always served herself last sat staring down at the most food she had seen in days, gathered there by the hands of every soul she had saved. She could not speak. She looked around the fire-lit chamber, at all those gaunt and grateful faces, at the warmth they had built together out of stone and stubbornness, and one widow's refusal to let the cold win. The cave kept warmth, Eli had told her once, but it kept loneliness too. Her husband had learned the second half of that lesson here, all those years ago. Two frightened young men, warm and alive and utterly alone in the dark. But Maribel was learning the other half now, that the same stone that could hold a person in their loneliness could hold a whole community in its warmth, if only someone was brave enough, and foolish enough, and kind enough to open the door. She was not alone in the dark, not anymore. She lifted her bowl, and she divided it again, back among the children, the way she always would. And outside, the storm screamed on into its seventh day, and the food was nearly gone. And not one soul in that warm and crowded cave knew if they would see the spring, but they would face it together. And somehow, for now, in the warm heart of the mountain, a whole town had laughed at. That was enough. The storm did not end the way it had come. It had arrived all at once, with pressure and roar and a wall of white. But it left slowly, the way pain leaves a body that has carried it too long. The screaming gusts softened, hour by hour, into long, uneven moans against the mountain stone. The roar that had filled the world wore itself down to a whisper. And then, on the ninth day, silence. It came so gently that no one inside the cave noticed it at first. They had lived so long inside the noise that the quiet did not register as quiet. It registered as something missing, a held breath, an ache where a sound had been. It was old Eli Rourke who lifted his head and spoke. "Listen," he said, and they listened. There was nothing to hear, no wind, no roar, no white fury tearing at the canvas. Only the soft crackle of the small, faithful fire and the breathing of the people it had kept alive, and somewhere far above, through the natural chimney in the rock, a thin thread of pale light beginning to fall. The storm was over. For a long moment, no one moved. After so many days of fighting simply to stay alive, the stillness was almost too much to bear. They sat in the warm dark, and they did not quite believe it, the way a person who has been ill a long time does not quite believe the morning they wake without the fever. Then Maribel rose, and she walked to the entrance, and she pulled back the heavy double canvas, and the light poured in. The world outside had been remade. The hollow lay buried beneath a sea of white, so deep and so still that it no longer looked like a place where people lived at all. Roofs had collapsed, fences had vanished, whole sheds had been erased beneath drifts packed hard as stone. The mountain had judged the valley without mercy, and the valley had not won. But the sky was the deep, clean, impossible blue that only comes after the worst has passed. And the sun lay across all that ruined white like a blessing, and the air was so sharp and so clear it hurt to breathe. One by one, the people of the cave crept out to see it. They stood at the mouth of the mountain, blinking in the brilliant light, this strange gathering of souls the storm had thrown together. The carpenter and the freight hauler, the young mother and the old miner, the banished daughter of the hardest man in the hollow, the widow they had all once laughed at, and the children. Lily Geddes, recovered now, her cheeks pink again, took one wobbling step out into the dazzling snow, and immediately lost her footing. She sat down hard and adrift with a startled little gasp, and then, before anyone could move to help her, before anyone could even draw breath, she laughed. A bright, helpless, delighted child's laugh, bursting out of her into the clean, cold air, echoing off the snow and the stone and the impossible blue sky. And it froze every adult standing there, because after 9 days of hearing only the wind, only the cracking of ice, only the sounds of people trying not to die, the laughter of a child sounded almost holy. Hollis Geddes turned his face away, his eyes shining. Brock Tanner, the big, rough freight hauler, made a sound in his chest he could not control. And Jed Coburn, the carpenter who had laughed loudest at the widow all those weeks ago, stood there in the blinding light and let the tears run freely down his weathered face, and did not bother to wipe them, and did not care who saw. Maribel watched the child laugh in the snow, and she felt something in her own chest, something that had been frozen since the morning her husband did not wake, finally, gently, begin to thaw. It took days for the hollow to dig itself out enough for people to move through the town again, and when they could, the truth came out. It came out the way the sun had come out, all at once, lighting up everything the storm had hidden. Because Cyrus Thorne's warehouse still stood, not damaged, not buried, standing whole and sound while half the cabins in the hollow lay broken under the snow. And when the townsfolk got close enough to see it clearly, they understood why. The roof had been reinforced from the inside, braced with extra beams before the storm ever arrived. The cracks in the walls had been packed tight with clay against the wind. Channels had been cut in the drifts around the building to keep the pressure from collapsing it. Cyrus Thorne had prepared. He had read the same low geese and the same strange wind that Maribel had read. And he had spent his days making certain that one building in all the hollow would survive the storm in perfect safety. Just not for anyone except himself. And inside that warehouse, behind its locked and reinforced door, sat the thing Verena had told them about by the firelight. Food, stacked flour barrels, salt pork, beans, lamp oil, enough to have kept every family in the hollow fed and warm and safe through the entire storm. It had sat there, counted, guarded, untouched, while children froze in cabins only a few streets away. The crowd that gathered at the warehouse door was quiet at first. Jed Coburn reached it first. The carpenter stood before the locked door, and he raised one big fist, and he hammered on it hard enough to shake frost loose from the hinges. "Open it, Cyrus," he called. "We know what's in there." For a long moment, nothing. Then the door opened, and Cyrus Thorne stood in the gap, and he looked out at the people of the hollow gathered in the ruined snow, and Maribel saw that he had changed. He looked older, smaller somehow in the hard winter light. The smooth confidence that had hung on him like a fine coat was gone. He had spent the storm alone in his safe and well-braced building, surrounded by all the food in the world and not a single soul to share it with. And it had cost him something. Maribel could see that it had. But not enough. Not yet. "This is my property," Cyrus said. His voice tried for its old smoothness and fell short. I prepared. I planned. I did the work no one else would do. A man can't be expected to give away what's his, simply because others were too foolish to... Too foolish, said a voice. It was Hollis Geddes, the man who had carried his dying daughter up a mountain. He stepped forward, and his face was very white. My Lily nearly died, Hollis said quietly. In a cabin 3 streets from this door, 3 streets from all this food. His voice shook. You let her near die, Cyrus. You let a child near die. To protect your barrels. Cyrus's jaw worked. I owe no one. You let people starve, Hollis said. And now the others were murmuring, the crowd shifting, the anger rising like a tide. You sat in here, warm, fed, safe, and you let people starve. For a moment it seemed it might turn ugly. The crowd pressed in. Cyrus shrank back, and the cold thing in the man's face hardened into the old defense, the only language he had ever known. Everything I have, I earned, he said. Everything in this town runs on what I... Cyrus, it was Maribel. She had not pushed to the front. She had stood at the back of the crowd, the widow, the fool, the woman he had tried to ruin with a whispered rumor about cursed stone. But when she spoke, the crowd parted for her, and she walked forward through it until she stood face to face with the man who had done her every harm he could think to do. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. You protected your inventory, she said, and she let her eyes move, slowly, away from his face, out across the buried hollow, across the collapsed roofs, across the cabins where, for 9 long days, people had shivered in the dark. Not your people. The words fell into a silence so complete it seemed the whole valley was listening. Cyrus Thorne opened his mouth, and nothing came out, because there was no answer to it. There had never been an answer to it. He had built his whole life on the comfortable lie that what a man owns is the measure of what a man is. And standing there in the ruined snow, looking into the face of the woman he had laughed at and lied about and tried to break, surrounded by the gaunt and grieving people he had locked his door against. The lie finally, completely, failed him. No one shouted at him after that. No one needed to. The storm had already judged him, and everyone standing there knew it. And then Maribel did the one thing no one in that crowd expected. The thing they would tell and retell in the hollow for years, long after the snow melted and the cabins rose again. The crowd was angry. The crowd wanted its reckoning. There was talk, low and dangerous, of taking what was inside the warehouse by force, of putting the man out into the cold he had been so willing to leave others in. And Maribel Vance raised one frostbitten hand, and the crowd quieted, because by now they had learned to listen when she spoke. No, she said. She turned to Cyrus. You have a daughter, Maribel said quietly, who walked out of your door into a killing storm because she could not bear what you were doing, who carried food up a mountain in the dark and lost her home for it, who has more courage in her than you have shown in your whole hoarding life. Cyrus flinched. Across the crowd, Verena Thorne stood very still. She didn't do it to shame you, Maribel said. She did it because somebody in your house had to remember how to be human, and it wasn't going to be you. She paused. So here's your choice, Cyrus Thorne. The only one that matters now. She gestured at the warehouse door behind him. You can keep standing in that doorway, guarding your barrels, until the day you die alone behind them. A rich man, A safe man. A man nobody ever loved and nobody ever missed. Her voice was not cruel. It was almost gentle, and that was somehow worse. Or you can open that door yourself. Not because we made you, because you finally understood what it's for. She stepped back. Nobody's going to take it from you, Cyrus, she said. That wouldn't mean a thing. The only thing that would mean anything is if you give it. And then she simply waited. The whole hollow waited. And Cyrus Thorne stood in the doorway of his warehouse in the brilliant, unforgiving light, and looked at all those faces, and looked at his daughter standing among the people who had taken her in when he had cast her out. Verena did not look away from him. She did not glare. She did not plead. She only looked at her father with eyes that had finally stopped being afraid of him. And in that look was everything Cyrus Thorne had thrown away. Every winter he had counted barrels instead of holding his child. Every neighbor he had turned into a debtor. Every door he had locked against the cold of others, while his own heart froze solid behind it. And something in the man broke. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet collapse of a wall that has stood too long and held back too much. His shoulders came down. His face, the hard, flat face that had denied comfort to half the valley, crumpled like a child's. And Cyrus Thorne turned slowly and pushed the warehouse door wide open, all the way open, until the morning light poured in across the stacked barrels and the sacks of flour and all the warmth he had hoarded against the world. "Take it," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Take what you need, all of you." He swallowed. It should have been open from the start. Then he looked at his daughter. "Verena," he said, and the name cracked in his throat. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to be different, but I want to learn. If you'll have me." He could not say any more. Verena Thorne crossed the snow to her father. She did not throw her arms around him. It was too soon for that, and they both knew it. Some things take more than a single morning to mend. But she took his hand, this hard, cold man who had cast her out, and she held it. "Then start by handing out flour," she said softly. "We can talk about the rest come spring." And the daughter and the father, side by side, began to carry the warehouse's hoarded warmth out into the hands of the hollow. It was not forgiveness, exactly. Forgiveness like that does not come all at once. But it was a beginning. And in the ruined, shining morning, that was a great deal more than anyone had thought possible. Maribel watched the food go out into the arms of the hollow, and she did not feel triumphant. She felt only quiet. She could have broken Cyrus Thorne. The town would have helped her. But breaking a man only teaches him the cold he already knows, showing him the door out of it. That was the harder thing, and the only one worth doing. Spring came slowly to the mountain. It always does, but it came. The drifts that had buried the hollow softened and shrank. Water ran in the gullies, bright and loud. The black branches put out their first tentative green, and the air lost its killing edge, and the long white silence gave way, at last, to birdsong. The hollow rebuilt itself, but it did not rebuild the same. The new cabins rose with earth packed against their outer walls, because the people had learned the hard way that the wind mattered more than how a wall looked. Canvas curtains appeared behind front doors, all through the valley. Folks who had once laughed at the idea of living in a hole in the mountain now studied the flow of air and heat the way the old miners had once studied unstable rock. And most of that knowledge came from one woman, not through speeches. Maribel Vance had never been one for speeches. It came through quiet work. She went from cabin to cabin, that spring and the next, showing people how to narrow a draft instead of building a bigger fire, how to raise a bed off a cold floor, how to make a wall that held warmth instead of only pretending to. She gave away everything she knew, freely, the way the warmth in the cave had been given, and slowly, the hollow stopped being the kind of place that let its people freeze. It became instead the kind of place that looked after its own. The cave itself was never quite given up. Supplies stayed stored there now, year-round, a shared store against the next hard winter. Dry wood under canvas, lamp oil, beans, a warm and waiting heart inside the mountain, kept ready for whoever might need it. The people took to calling it Vance Hollow. No one quite decided when the name began. It simply was, the way a true thing simply is. The place a whole town had laughed at had become the place a whole town built its safety around. And no one ever laughed about a worthless cave again. There was one more thing Maribel needed to do. She did it alone, on a quiet spring morning, when the snowmelt dripped in steady rhythms through the rock above, and the entrance stood open to the soft new light. She walked into the deepest chamber, carrying a lamp she no longer truly needed. The knife marks were still there. Of course they were. Carved into the eastern wall by two frightened young men a lifetime ago, one of whom had grown old beside her, one of whom slept now in the spring earth outside. She stood before them a long time. She understood them differently now. They were not only a record of survival. They were not only weeks counted in the dark by a boy who would one day be her husband. They were a message, she saw now, sent forward across all those years, from a frightened young man to a woman he had not yet met. You can survive this, the mark said. The cold, the dark, the loneliness, the loss. You can refuse it, week by week, mark by mark, until the spring comes. I did. So can you. Maribel reached into her coat, and she took out a knife. Her husband's knife. The little one from the box she had carried up the mountain through the storm. The one Eli said had cut these very marks all those years ago, kept in close with the medicines ever since, because a man ought to hold on to whatever got him through. And she set its blade against the stone, just below the last of his old marks. And she carved one new line. Only one. The scrape of steel against rock echoed soft through the chamber. When it was done, she stood back and she looked at it. All his marks, all those weeks of his fear and his survival, and beneath them, hers. A single line. A single week. The one she had spent in this cave, with a storm at the door and a whole town in her arms. One, said a voice behind her. It was Eli Rourke. The old man had followed her, the way he sometimes did now, the last living witness to the winter that had made her husband. He looked at the single new mark, and something gentle moved in his weathered face. Only one? He asked. Maribel looked at the mark. Then she looked back, toward the entrance of the cave, where the spring light spilled bright across the stone floor. Outside, she could hear them. The Hollow's children, run up the mountain to play in the melting snow, their laughter ringing off the rocks. She could hear Lily Geddes and the Tanner boy and the others chasing the old gray dog through the wet grass. She could hear Verena Thorne's voice among them, light in a way it had never been when she lived in her father's cold house. And she could hear, somewhere in all of it, the sound of a town that had learned how to keep its people warm. Maribel smiled, a small, tired, peaceful smile. He counted his weeks, she said softly, because he was waiting for winter to end, counting the days until he could leave this place behind. She slid the knife back into her coat. "I'm not waiting for winter to end anymore," she said. She rested one hand against the cave wall. The stone was faintly warm beneath her palm, holding the gentle heat of the spring sun gathered somewhere above. And for a long moment she stood there, the widow they had all once laughed at, in the warm dark of the mountain that had held the man she loved, and now held her, and now held a whole town's worth of warmth and laughter and second chances. The grief had not vanished. It never would. It had simply found its place in her, the way warmth finds its place in stone, settling deep, no longer a thing that stole the heat from her bones, but a thing she could carry, steady and quiet, into the years that were left. She was not finishing his story anymore. She had begun her own. Outside, a child laughed, and the old dog barked, and the spring light poured warm and golden across the floor of Vance Hollow. And Maribel Vance walked out of the dark, toward it.